Here in the Northern Hemisphere, we're technically entering into cold and flu season. I say technically because while it is true, cold and flu season's coming up, I personally have not had a cold since late 2019, thanks to, with a few exceptions, I basically wear a mask everywhere that's public and inside. I don't eat or drink inside. And, I have got better hand washing and face touching habits. And I also, stay up to date on all my vaccinations. But yes, on a population level, the fall and winter tends to be when we see an uptick in sniffles and things. So with that in mind, today I wanted to talk about cold medicine. Specifically, let's talk about that recent FDA announcement that might cause most, if not all, of our over-the-counter cold medications to go away here in the United States, and also why other useless treatments will remain available on the same shelves, and why Big Pharma is ultimately to blame for all of this. So a few weeks ago, an FDA advisory panel announced that there is no difference between the oral consumption of the drug phenylephrine and placebo, despite the fact that phenylephrine is in everything that is currently on the shelves to supposedly treat the symptoms of a cold. Experts assume that this means the FDA will soon revoke authorization for the use of the drug, and in response, CVS has voluntarily decided to pull those products from the shelves immediately. The FDA panel's decision surprised exactly no one in the medical field because doctors and researchers have known for decades now that oral phenylephrine is useless. Literally decades they've known this. Here's a paper from May of 2006 going over some of the evidence. Now, note that I do make sure to say oral phenylephrine because the main problem seems to be that the drug is completely consumed more or less by your gut when you take it orally. It is rendered completely useless before it has a chance to get to anywhere where it can do some good. But there are still some nasal sprays with that drug that might actually work. We're not talking about those. So it's great that this useless drug is finally going into the bin, but I found it interesting that CVS voluntarily jumped into action to remove these products while they continue to stock other completely useless products on the shelves, as pointed out last week by Beth Mole at Ars Technica. For decades now, doctors and scientists have pointed out that pharmacies sell real scientifically proven medicine right alongside homeopathy, which is literally just sugar pills. It's literally a placebo. Absolute quackery with zero active ingredients in it by design, because the basis of homeopathy is that substances get more powerful the more you dilute them, up to and beyond the point where not a single atom of the original substance remains, because they think water remembers it. Literally, that is what homeopathy is, and it's right here next to the real medicine at the pharmacy. The Ars Technica article points out that the Center for Inquiry is actually suing CVS and Walgreens to get them to, at the very least, separate the snake oil from the real medicine because, like here in California, our pharmacies are allowed to sell whiskey, but it's not in the dental health section next to the medicated mouthwash. I agree that people are absolutely right to be annoyed that CVS is voluntarily throwing away shelves of cold medicines based on this one FDA advisory panel recommendation, but continues to refuse to do the same for homeopathy, which the FDA doesn't even evaluate in the first place. But as annoying as the alternative medicine industry is, there's a much more infuriating story here, and it involves the industry that secretly controls the alternative medicine industry, and that, of course, is Big Pharma. That paper I mentioned earlier from 2006 contains some really interesting tidbits to get us started. Oral phenylephrine was approved by the FDA in 1976, along with, phenylpropanolamine and pseudoephedrine. At that point, there was already substantial evidence that unlike the other two drugs, phenylephrine was no better than placebo at relieving cold symptoms. But the FDA approved it based on unpublished manufacturer-sponsored studies conducted by commercial testing laboratories that resulted in 4 studies demonstrating efficacy compared with 7 demonstrating no difference between this dose and placebo. Thus, these researchers wrote in 2006, in our view, the panel reached a specious conclusion that was not based on a systematic systematic review of the available data. So the pharmaceutical industry got a big win there because they ran into trouble with the two drugs that actually worked. Phenylpropanolamine was taken off the shelves due to a link with strokes, and pseudoephedrine became increasingly harder for consumers to get due to its convenient ability to be turned into methamphetamine. More on that in a minute. As legislators called for products like Sudafed to be put behind the pharmacist counter, big pharma companies were able to put out products like Sudafed PE, which had the disadvantage of not doing shit for anything, but the advantage of being really easy for the consumer to grab and take to the checkout when they are currently suffering from sinuses that feel like they're the size of apples and they don't feel like doing extensive research on the cold medicine they're buying because they trust the pharmacy to sell them something that's going to work. But okay, let's take a step back and talk about that other still legal and actually effective drug, pseudoephedrine. As far back as the early 1980s, there was evidence that it had the potential to be turned into one of the most addictive substances the world had ever seen, methamphetamine. Gene Hayslip was a higher-up at the DEA who had succeeded in turning Quaaludes from a potential epidemic into a drug that would be forgotten today entirely were it not for Bill Cosby. He did it by controlling the drug at its source. Unlike cannabis or heroin, you can't just grow a field of Quaaludes. You need large factories to produce your main ingredients. And so he established serious regulations that made the drug very difficult for dealers to get. It wasn't worth it for them anymore. And he wanted to do the same thing with meth, which more or less requires ephedrine or pseudoephedrine to easily make. Two chemicals that, once again, needed to be produced by large factories. He and his staff drew up a law to regulate those chemicals, and to his surprise, politicians loved it. You know, it was flying through Congress, through the Justice Department, through the White House. It was looking like it was going to be approved in record time. That is, until the pharmaceutical industry caught wind of it. Regulating those chemicals would cost them more money to prove their own legitimacy, so they were against it. So the bill ended up passing and going into effect in 1989, but with a specific carve-out for amphetamines that were to be used specifically for over-the-counter pharmaceutical drugs. So what happened was that first, this law worked really well. Dealers on the West Coast, which at the time was the only place meth was running rampant, reported being unable to get ephedrine anymore, so the purity of meth dropped, meaning that addictions dropped, as did hospitalizations and deaths. The regulations were working. But the Mexican drug cartels started getting ephedrine and pseudoephedrine directly from the factories in India and the Czech Republic and elsewhere, and they funneled it into the United States. So Hayslip went to the factories and got them to agree to stop selling to the dealers. And the factories were like, hey, you could have brought this up before. We would have signed on to it. But okay, we'll stop selling them now.
We at Krebs Biochemicals would have been much, much happier if only there was some guidance given by the DEA or the proper authorities in the United States about these are the legitimate users. You are okay if you have any business dealings with these guys. Guidance in that fashion would have certainly helped us at Krebs Biochemicals in being perhaps a better citizen. Maybe we do not know how much of our material would have landed into the illegitimate hands. That could have certainly been prevented.
Once that happened, once again, deaths dropped. Another success. But remember that carve-out? Well, here's where it came back to bite America in the ass. The dealers set up a bunch of their own little pharmaceutical companies to legally buy the ephedrine and pseudoephedrine in bulk to make over-the-counter tablets, which the dealers then bought and then crushed back up and turned into meth. So in the 90s, Hayslip tried to close that loophole and get a regulation put in place on wholesale pill sellers. But once again, the big pharma lobby stepped in. Now, even with these regulations, the pharmaceutical companies would still be allowed to buy and sell these ingredients, but there would still be a few extra hurdles in place that would end up costing them time and money. So they agreed to accept a regulation, but they convinced legislators to allow a 1-year grace period for the industry to adjust to the new rules. And also, probably to give them time to start producing more products using phenylephrine, which again, they knew at the time is completely useless, but they also know it's going to make them way more money if they can have that on the shelves by the time these new regulations go into place. That 1-year grace period also allowed the dealers to adjust to these new rules, meaning that by the time the regulations became active, the dealers already had a good jump on new ways to get the ingredients they needed to make meth. By the way, PBS produced a great documentary detailing all of this in 2011. They talked to a pharmaceutical lobbyist who had this to say about what he and his pals did.
To industry executives like Alan Rexinger, Hayslip and the DEA were out of control.
Now, what would you do if there was a bill out there that would negatively affect your industry? It wouldn't make any difference if you were from the dill pickle industry or from the over-the-counter medicine industry. You would naturally do what you have to do. Quite frankly, we appealed to a higher authority.
Well, gosh, Alan, I can't say for sure because I don't work in the pickle industry, but I guess I'd start by asking how exactly drug dealers are using homemade bombs to turn my pickles into highly addictive substances that destroy entire communities. And then I'd find a way to stop that from happening. But I can see that you instead would choose to pay congressmen millions of dollars to allow it to keep happening because, frankly, you are going to make money whether people are buying your pickles to put on their sandwiches or whether they're buying your pickles to turn them into drugs. So it's all the same to you, you fucking psychopath. Okay, and I can't help it. There's so much gold in this documentary. Here's one more. This is a Pfizer executive named Stephen Robbins arguing why they tried to stop a law that would require the buyers of Sudafed to have to go to the counter to get it instead of just pulling it off the shelf. And if you're just reading this in the transcript, I highly recommend you click through to watch at least minute 40 in this documentary, just so you can appreciate how this guy just looks and sounds like the biggest piece of shit on the planet.
And I think we've always been opposed to that because we feel like that isn't fair balance in terms of access for the legitimate consumers versus those people who are using it for illicit means. There's been a lot made about how much profit was made by people who were buying this for illicit reasons. On the other side of that coin, we end up paying for the shrinkage, that is the theft, okay, that these smurfers do by going into stores and stealing product. And I will tell you, I'm not sure that anyone's done the analysis, and in the end, I'm not sure we made any additional money versus that product we had to actually replace because people had stolen it illegally.
A few points here, Steve. First of all, as far as I'm aware, if someone steals a box of Sudafed from CVS, that's CVS's problem, not Pfizer's problem. CVS already paid you for the box, so you win either way. Secondly, you know what would stop most people from being able to steal Sudafed right off the shelf? Putting it behind the counter, like they do with the cigarettes and the fucking razor blades. Jesus Christ. Anyway, I'm skipping over a lot of detail just to get to the main point here. At every step in this process since the 1970s, the pharmaceutical industry has placed profits over human lives. Had they not had a decent lobby back then the FDA would never have approved the useless drug phenylephrine, and the DEA would have had regulations in place to stop meth from becoming an epidemic in the United States in the first place. Instead, we've experienced nearly 50 years now of this insipid back and forth. And oh my God, you know what? I just realized that this is exactly what happened with COVID. Had governments had a uniform and sensible policy in place and the infrastructure to handle sick people quickly and efficiently, the virus would have been wiped out before it became an epidemic. And because we allowed it to become an epidemic, the virus evolved to continue to escape immunity, and now we're just probably going to deal with it forever. So that's great. In fact, on that point, reports coming out from the past decade or so suggest that the meth coming out of Mexican cartels is now so pure and so cheap that honestly, CVS could put Sudafed in baskets right next to the exit. Home cooks still would not be able to compete with the Mexican stuff. A careful viewer of Breaking Bad might know that there is an alternative way to make meth that doesn't require ephedrine or pseudoephedrine, and that appears to be what is happening. Phenyl-2-propanone, or P2P, is how the Hells Angels used to make meth back in the 1980s. The cartels figured out a way to use that to make meth using a better process that produces a better, cheaper product. So now we come to the final bitter irony. For years now, you've probably been using a cold medication that doesn't work in the slightest, all because the one medication that does work was once used to make a street drug via a method that has not been in use for the past decade or so. All because of corrupt, amoral cockroaches like this guy. Thanks, Steve. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.